people's interests. And I have to admit, I've enjoyed very much having the opportunity to speak to people about the history. I have to tell you, though, that it's become a very humbling kind of experience. I did not realize the amount of time and effort it takes to dig some of these things out. You don't realize how much things are sort of hidden away, not because anybody's making an effort to hide them, but simply because through the passage of time, they haven't become all that obvious to folks. And so it's taken a lot of time, taken a lot of effort, and it's taken a lot of help. And I want to take just a moment to thank some of the people and organizations that have helped me in this process, just for the presentations today, not for all of the different segments of the book that I've been looking into. The Tillamook County Pioneer Museum has just been a phenomenal resource, and I recommend it to everyone out there who's interested in the history of this area. The state archive staff have been really great about digging into records that were to a large extent lost and hidden away. And I appreciate this so much. Because one of the segments today is on oysters, I really had to have some specific help from families who are involved in oystering in this area. The Hayes family has been critical to my research, also the Hansen family. And I spent a fascinating afternoon talking to Mark Whitwer when we were talking about more current topics. Of an exceptional resource is the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery. They have been so helpful and so knowledgeable. It's just been great to work with them. And I've had some help from some other folks. Tim Carpenter who's a local resident and well known because of his work with the fire district, has very often been a critical person to kind of pointing me in the right direction for finding the clues that led me to the information. And the Tillamook Air Museum played a really important role in looking at the efforts and the information that I needed for the World War II segment, which is the third segment today. There are three segments. First is on oysters. Second is on the Goodale family. And the third is on 4 stories that come from the World War II era in Netarts. And I picked those topics because those are the ones people have asked me about. There's been an interest in the oyster industry for a long time. And almost every time I've given one of these presentations, people have asked questions about it. The same is true for the Goodale family and for World War II. And so I thought, wow, let's wrap those together and make a presentation about those particular sections today. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the oyster industry. It has a fascinating, I have to tell you, history. I had no idea that it would contain such interesting elements. I mean, there's murder, there's corruption, there's robbery, there's every kind of thing that human beings engage in. And I'm going to tell you about some of that because one of the things you get to do when you're writing these things is you have to do a little bit of self-editing. And so I'm going to try and give you a good history without getting into some of the detail that might be somewhat more critical. So let's talk about oysters. Oysters have played an absolutely critical role in the development of the Netarts area, particularly in the Bay Area. It's not something that I have to admit I knew very much about. Other than eating them, I haven't had a lot of familiarity with oysters. And so it's been a real educational opportunity for me. One of the things I found out early on is that, and this I thought was most interesting for a critter that is so important to the history of this area, is that oysters are not, actually Netarts Bay is not a very good place to grow oysters, as it turns out. It lacks the fresh water that really is necessary for that kind of large quantity and quality scale of oyster growing. It also has some tidal surge issues, and there's also some things that have happened at the bottom of the bay. And as a result of all of that, it's one of those things where I think it's so fascinating that oysters had a struggle to survive in Netarts Bay. And you know, it's kind of interesting because Netartians are a tough group of folks. They have had some very difficult times over the years, and they've persisted and they've worked hard. and it's the same for those oysters. So it's been really interesting to actually find out something about the oysters. The oyster that was originally growing here, the native oyster, which we call the Olympic oyster, was Ostrea lorida. Now, there's some debate about that name, apparently, in some of the reading that I did to look at this. I'm going to be very candid with you and tell you that I'm not going to sort that naming issue out. I think you need to go talk to your friendly neighborhood marine biologist. He will fill that gap in your life far better than I can. And I think that it's one of those things where you learn something every time you do one of these studies. Now, there are a lot of tribes that ate oysters and ate a lot of oysters, but the Netarts Tillamook were not one of those folks. If you look down like the Chumash down in the San Francisco Bay Area, big oyster eaters. But that was not true of the people that lived in this area. And we know that because there were some digs, some studies that were done. And I'm going to take and show you a picture of one of those. And that is the Newman Dig that was done back in the late 1950s. And here you see them digging out an area out on Netarts Spit where they were searching to find the history of the Tillamook in the Netarts area. And one of the things that you do when you do that is you take a look at the middens. And the middens are basically the garbage piles for the village. And they found that those folks ate a lot of elk. They ate deer, they ate seals, sea lions, they ate a great variety of fish, and they ate a number of different kinds of clams, but they didn't eat oysters. Now, I don't think this bothered the oysters much. They said, well, that's just fine. We'll just keep on growing and we'll just keep on changing and we'll just keep on making this bay ours. And so that's what they did. Now, things kind of changed when in the 1850s, and that's because there was gold found in California in 1849. So, okay, hundreds of miles away, there's gold being found. How does that change things in Netarts Bay? Well, as it turns out, back in the 1840s, oyster eating became very popular in the United States. And so when all of those folks that were digging for gold or helping others dig for gold came to California, they wanted to eat oysters. And starting in 1849, they began doing that. And they began doing it very rapidly. And it wasn't very long before the California supply of oysters was gone. Interestingly enough, in 1852, a ship that is coming to Oregon for different materials actually has a shipwreck and is wrecked at the mouth of Yaquina Bay. That shipwreck, then there are the sailors who are rescued from that, and the local native folks there feed them oysters. And suddenly they discover that there's oysters in Oregon. And so there becomes a demand for oysters to be harvested in Oregon and as well Washington State. Now, and I have to keep changing this back and forth here. The Netarts Bay actually becomes one of those places where people want to see oysters and want to find oysters. And I thought it was interesting to find that there's actually a map done by the federal government in 1858. And this is one of those things where you just keep digging until you find it. And if you look at this map of the Netarts area done by the federal government in 1858, you will see right over here that Netarts Bay, and it says Netarts or Oyster Bay. And so this area by 1858 was known by its oysters, known for its oysters sufficiently that it actually became part of a title. Now that was the unofficial title, but it was still a title. So that was, I think, one of those things that I thought was really fascinating by all of these. And that continued on. Now this is a map done by also by the U.S. Surveyor in 1859. And here's the road coming in from Tillamook into Netarts. You see the bay. And right down here, you see a cluster of claims, land claims that were made. And that's because the oyster people began moving into the area, and they were, some of them located along the spit and some of them located down in this area, Wilson Beach. But many of them went up into this area just towards the head of the bay here. Now, they began calling the area Oysterville because that was how they made their living. I should point out that Oysterville was a title that got used a lot of places on the West Coast, but this is the Netarts version of that. Now, these folks that came in were not what you'd really call settlers. They were sort of temporary residents, and they utilized the Tillamook women, native women that lived down in this area, to actually do the harvesting for them. In fact, it is kind of indicative that it was a temporary kind of thing, because when a visitor from another part of Tillamook came over in 1867, he described the Netarts area as a conglomeration of log and clapboard huts. So it wasn't exactly what you'd call a thriving kind of community. One of the first people to actually begin a more settled pattern and build the first house, according to Warren Vaughn, is Timothy Goodale. Now, he was a trapper and explorer. He was a guide to John Fremont. He was a friend of Kit Carson. He's one of the people that helped create the Oregon Trail. And he comes to live in Netarts. And when he comes to live in Netarts, he begins harvesting oysters, and he comes in about 1865. Unfortunately, Mr. Goodale is murdered by another one of the harvesters, and his widow, Virginia, was called Jenny. She sells Timothy's things after his death, and we know that he was harvesting oysters because that was part of what she sold, oyster tools and a claim for oysters. We also know that another of Timothy Goodale's daughters was involved with oyster harvesting. Celia was her name. She marries a man, William Thompson, also known as Portuguese Joe Thompson. Portuguese Joe because he had come from Portugal to this area. And he's also an oyster harvester, and he has a house down near Jackson Creek. The first large-scale oyster operation that actually occurs in Netarts Bay is created by a man named Christopher Christensen. He was known as Klaus Christensen, and he came from Denmark. And he came over to the United States because his brother had an oyster harvesting operation in Willapa Bay. In 1868, Klaus moves to Tillamook, and he began shipping oysters by schooner, schooners that could come into the bay in those days, and by mule train, and occasionally by oxen team. Just hard for me to imagine an oxen team climbing over the mountains with oysters, but apparently that was the way they did it. And he shipped those to San Francisco and to Portland. Unfortunately, eventually this becomes not all that profitable for Mr. Christensen due to some shipping issues. It was a task to ship things there. And also because he was not well treated by some of the oyster buyers. They didn't pay him appropriately. So after 6 years, he moves to the Little Nestucca River area, and he starts a dairy, one of the first dairies in Tillamook. That demand, however, continues to be great along the entire Pacific coast. In fact, you can see how that demand became rapidly an issue because in Willapa Bay actually imposed a limit on harvesting clear back in 1855. So even before there was much going on in Netarts. And that may have actually been the reason that there was an interest in looking for other sites such as Netarts. Now, by 1918, we know that there's not a lot of oyster growing in Netarts Bay. And we know that because the United States government sends a fisheries expert to do a survey all along the Pacific coast. And he reports that Netarts oysters are occasionally available locally, but not otherwise any kind of a crop. So what happened to all those oysters? Well, that's kind of an interesting story. In fact, there's a great little, I will take it aside here and tell you there's an interesting story that comes out during this period, and it talks about the oysters actually freezing at low tide. And while they're in this frozen condition, the tide comes in and it picks them up and it actually floats them out to sea. And the oysters disappear from Netarts Bay. That's not a great story. It's one of those things where you just sit there and say, oh, that can't be right. That just seems too much. But I talked to Jesse Hayes, who's a well-respected and well-known oyster grower, and he says it's quite possible that it happened. In fact, he's actually witnessed in Tillamook Bay the same phenomenon occurring. So it is possible that some of the oysters disappeared from Netarts Bay by floating out to sea. However, I think it's a lot more likely that they disappeared here for the same reason that they disappeared almost everywhere along the Pacific coast, and that is they got over-harvested. So that by the 1870s, certainly by the 1880s, oystering was a much more challenging situation. Now in the 1920s, the states decide, this is the states of Oregon and Washington, that they want to restore the oyster industry. And they began looking around for options to do that. Now, that's when the Hayes family becomes an important factor in this thing, because Jesse Hayes, who is the grandfather of the current Jesse, actually sees oyster shell in the dredge spoils for the Bay Ocean Resort back in about 1911. He was working on that dredging operation. So he realizes that oystering is a possibility in this area. And in 1912, Jesse Hayes becomes the first state permit holder for oyster harvesting in Oregon. Now, the oyster folks want to see more of this kind of activity. And so I want to show you a picture of Jesse Hayes working with, and these happen to be representatives of Washington State University, who are looking at the oyster possibilities and the development of an oyster farming operation. Now, the oysters they're talking about were called Japanese oysters, Chrysostrea gigas. What a great name, Chrysostrea gigas. Now that name, Japanese oyster, actually gets changed to Pacific oyster during World War II. But they began looking at the idea of Tillamook Bay being a major oyster farming area. And as a result, the Hayes family gets involved with oyster farming to a very great extent. And here's Jesse actually planting oysters in this happens to be in Tillamook Bay. And the whole family begins pushing for, and this is the Hayes family, various generations, expanding oyster harvesting along the entire Pacific coast. That continues on, particularly after World War II. And that oyster harvesting operation becomes really much more of a large-scale activity. This happens to be a picture of the 1940s when the Hayes family turns to planting oysters in Netarts Bay. Now there's a major role played here by that particular family, and in particular Sam Hayes, because he becomes one of the major oyster growers in Netarts Bay. In fact, in a 1965 state report, there are only 2 commercial oyster growers shown for Netarts Bay. One is Sam Hayes, and the other is a man named Ed Ferry. But again, they start suffering from the same kind of problems that I mentioned earlier, the lack of fresh water. They also start having some other issues. There's an issue with some illegal activity that goes on with some of the employees. There's lumber mill pollution concerns. There's a lack of regulatory oversight by the county as cited by the state. And there's just sort of a reduced interest and a reduced activity. But the thing that does kind of puts the final tombstone on the oyster industry is that the Japanese oyster drill inadvertently gets introduced in Netarts Bay. And this is an incredible predator, and it pretty much wipes out oysters in the bay. After that, this is in the 60s, the Hayes Oyster Company decides that they're going to leave Netarts and they're going to concentrate elsewhere. And they decide that they're going to donate their oyster shucking facility to the state of Oregon, which is then used by the Oregon State University for fisheries research. And that goes on for a number of years. But now, as I'm sure many of you know, that facility is used by the Tillamook anglers for their salmon hatchery. And so it continues to be an important site on Netarts Bay. Now, the Hayes family didn't lose all interest in the Netarts Bay. They encourage a man named Lee Hansen to move to Netarts, and they help him find a site. And Lee builds on that site in 1978. And the thing that he builds at that time is the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery. And this is Mr. Hayes holding some of the oyster seed that's grown at that hatchery. And in his hands are millions of oysters in seed form. Lee becomes a major force in oyster growing along the entire Pacific coast. And he's known internationally for his selfless advocacy for aquaculture. In fact, the hatchery is still involved around the world. And in fact, when I was talking to them, they were actually doing some work in Italy. The hatchery continues to be a respected major resource in oysters today. It is one of the primary international resources for effective shellfish growing. Now, that's not the only important thing that happens in 1978, because at that time, another person moves to Netarts Bay, and that is Mark Whitwer. Mark buys 36 acres of oyster growing area, and he actively markets these smaller Netarts oysters as a gourmet seafood. And he goes to New York, and he goes to San Francisco, and he goes to Seattle and Portland, and he develops and promotes Netarts as a gourmet site for oysters. And as a result of that, and the result of a lot of other people's hard work, Netarts is once again known and a respected source of gourmet oysters. Now, I think it's interesting that after all these years in developing oyster farming, now there's an interest in actually reintroducing Olympic oysters. And so that's another aspect of oyster growing in this area. This article was in the Oregonian, shows that Oregon State University's Anya Robinson and Chris Langdon, associated with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, John Johnson, used that set-aside area that is south of Whiskey Creek as a site for the reintroduction of this native oyster. They obtained a grant to plant 6 million seed in that area. And with the help of Mark Whitwer and the Whiskey Creek Hatchery, they actually establish a colony of oysters, native oysters in that area, which continues to persist to this day. Now, I'd like to report that it's thriving, but I'm afraid that's not exactly true. It has struggled because of the freshwater issue and because of some of the conditions that have changed in the bay, but it does persist. And so it indicates that there is some future for native oysters in Netarts Bay. And in fact, the Friends of Netarts Bay Webs is considering helping bring back those oysters and make that part of the heritage of Netarts Bay. It's pretty clear at this point that Netarts Bay will continue to be a place where oysters are a part of it, an important part of its activities and its economics. I'd like to pause at this point and see if there are any questions and see if there's anything that I can help answer.
John, it doesn't look like there are any specific questions about the oysters. Kathleen has a more general question, which I'll hold off on until the end.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, we'll move on to the second topic for today, which is to talk about the Goodale family. In the very first year, when I was first starting to make these presentations, we talked about Timothy Goodale, and I mentioned Timothy just a moment ago. And he was one of those things that was a real surprise, because I hadn't anticipated that we would find one of Western America's early explorers actually residing in Netarts. He was, as I mentioned, he was a trapper and a mountain man. He had some great adventures with Kit Carson that involved a variety of activities, some of them economic and some of them more exploratory. Unfortunately, Timothy does get murdered in 1869. And I'm going to move on to a map that shows this is the trail that existed in 1858 that came into the Netarts area. And right in this area, just off the map, is where Tim is murdered. And he's murdered by a man named Jones. Jones was known as a troublemaker, and he actually had a reputation for having killed other people. And most of that comes from reading Warren Vaughn's diary. Now, when I told this story back some years ago, I ended it with the death of Timothy and didn't go beyond that. But as we all know, when someone's life is taken, it affects not just that person, but also many others. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened to the Goodale family and kind of explore what their history. Now, he, as I mentioned earlier, he was married to a woman named Virginia. She called Jenny. And they had a daughter, Winona. Now, Jenny was the second wife of Timothy, and she was a Lemhi Shoshone. Now, this is the same tribe as Sacagawea or Sacagawea, depending on which tribe you happen to belong to. Depends, changes the pronunciation a little bit. And it's likely that Timothy met her after his first wife had died through the offices of Baptiste Charbonneau, which was Sacagawea's son, the one that was born during the Lewis and Clark expedition. And we know that because Baptiste was a business partner with Tim. They had some livestock operations that they conducted together. I mentioned also that there was a daughter, Winona, and Winona is a name that comes up several times in Timothy's history because he seemed to like that name, and in fact would encourage his other relatives to name their children Winona as well. There were some other children also associated with the Goodale family, some of whom are probably from the previous marriage, which was to an Absaroka woman. Absarokas, many people call that tribe Crow. They had several children, and we also know that Tim and Jenny were known for their kindness and thoughtfulness, and that as a result of that, they adopted a number of children, particularly children of mixed race. What we don't know for sure about the things that happened after the murder, we're going to have to speculate a little bit about. We do know that the killer disappeared into the mountains. That's confirmed both by Vaughn's diary and the Oregonian newspaper. The neighbors rallied around Jenny and her family. Several helped her navigate the estate and taxation laws. Being a Native American, she faced some challenges there because they did not have all of the legal rights that a citizen would have. Technically, Native Americans were not citizens of the United States until 1924. One of those interesting little bits of history. Ultimately, after Jenny pays all her taxes, she gets $33 from Tim's estate, and she uses that money to follow Jacob Heiberger. Now, Jacob was a former freighter and a family friend, and he had moved to Netarts with the Goodales in 1865. And after Timothy's murder, Heiberger moves up to the Puget Sound area in 1870. Jenny follows, taking her daughter Winona with her. Now they have some more children. In 1872, Margaret, who they called Maggie, was born. And then in 1873, a son, Amos, was born. 1874, Heiberger decides to move, and he becomes the founders of LaConner, Washington, which is over in the northeast part of Washington State. He marries Jenny on October 24th, 1878, and they have another son, Perry, who's born in 1880. So obviously they continued on. They had a marriage that lasted until her death in 1897. But it's also obvious from some of the information that I've read and gathered by some other people that there was stresses and strains in that marriage towards the end. We don't know all of the causes there. It's possible that some of it was associated with her race, also with some of the life decisions that Winona made. There was some speculation in some of the things I read that the fact that she was an Indian was a problem. As more white women moved into the Pacific Northwest, the marriages to Native American women became increasingly one of those things that was a challenge. Eventually, after Jenny's death in 1897, Heiberger marries another woman in 1898. This woman is Caledonia Jane Heiberger. And Jacob, they continued to be married until 1914, when Jacob dies in an accident that occurs with a horse team. Caledonia lives in the area until 1937, and she is buried next to Jacob in a cemetery in Spokane, Washington. I have here, I think, an interesting picture. This is the gravestone for Jenny, and here, and this is her daughter, Maggie. Maggie dies when she's 13 years old, and they wind up buried together in the cemetery. Interestingly enough, they're not anywhere close to Jacob and his second wife. And there's been a lot of speculation among historians, and historians love to speculate. But we don't really know what the real story is there and how that's sorted out. But it appears that there were some struggles that occurred. Now, the daughter Winona, who was 5 or 6 at the time of Tim's death, moves with Jenny and remains connected to the Heiberger siblings her entire life. She even names one of the children Maggie in memory of the sister who dies at 13. But she moves on, and this is a picture of Winona and her husband, Billy Hansen. Now, William Hansen moves to America from Denmark in 1885. They live in Spokane, and she works as a housekeeper in his home, and eventually they marry in 1901. They have 4 children listed in the 1910 census. Katie, who is 13 at the time, Maggie, who is 9, Amos, who is 11, and Ralph, who is 8. We don't know exactly, I was unable to find exactly how she died, but we do know that she had died by the time of the 1910 census. We also know that the families persisted, and this happens to be a picture of some of the Goodale, Heiberger, Hansen descendants who live in the Spokane area and continue to be a part of that community and the communities throughout the northwest or the northeast part of Washington State. So with that, I'd like to return to the woman who is at the center of the murder. And sometimes it's very challenging to track Native Americans because they weren't always kept track of in exactly the same way. And we have 2 different stories. One comes from the Goodale family, which, and they continue to live in the New York, Pennsylvania area. They felt that she left with the murderer, Jones, and disappeared into the mountains. Now, Warren Vaughn, who actually lived in the area, has a different perspective. His view is that Jenny, or that Winona, oh, I'm sorry, now I'm getting the names all mixed up, with this woman, I should say, went on to become a fine citizen. And so he continues to know her and to interact with her and to be involved with her change and growth. And so that suggests that she did not run off into the mountains with the murderer. And it seems unlikely that she would have done that anyway, given her response to her father's request not to associate with the Jones person. So who was this half-breed girl? That's what they called her.
So how are your buddies doing?
Doing well, celebrating.
Seems to be
Yeah.
some
How's
voice.
Spikey doing?
Oh, like up in the air.
Apparently,
Yeah. You can't seem to decipher.
I'm wondering if we can all mute our speakers, that'd be great. Thanks. Apparently, Goodale's had several children besides Winona, some adopted, some from the first marriage. We know that Celia, who married Portuguese Joe Thompson, was one of them. And we know that because the Goodales attended her marriage and her christening. So there's an actual physical record of it. Other people at the marriage were Betsy and James, who we also know were also known as Josephine and John Deshaw. Now, Deshaw was one of Tim's trapper friends from his days in that business. And he had apparently adopted these children and brought them with him. Little John moves to Netarts with the Goodales in 1865 and brings Josephine along. They are both listed in the 1870 census, living with John and Emmeline Whitman in the Nestockton district. It seems likely, given the age and other circumstances, that the mystery woman at the center of this murder is Josephine. She moves with her brother to what we call the Nestucca area now, after the murder, and lives with the friends, the Whitmans, to avoid Jones because there was a concern that he might return. Now, I have a picture of the Whitmans, and they live in the Nestucca area for some years, and then eventually they moved to Eastern Oregon because Emmeline has some health issues and needs to be in a drier climate. And I want to take just a moment to stop talking about the Goodales, because that's pretty much all I know about what happens to them at that point. And I want to talk a little bit about the Whitmans. Emmeline Whitman is actually one of the heroines of the late 1800s in Oregon. She is well known. She's not known under the name of Whitman. She's known under her maiden name, which is Trimble. Emmeline Trimble is a survivor of the Utter Van Orman disaster. Despite what you might see on TV or in the movies, there really weren't very many Native American attacks on Oregon Trail wagon trains. But there were some attacks. And in fact, the Utter Van Orman attack is considered one of the very worst. It began an attack on 44 travelers who were traveling near Salmon Falls, Idaho in 1860. There is a 2-day running battle. And as a result, only 16 of the travelers survived the fighting and the subsequent starvation, because once they flee, they have to flee without any food. And they struggle through the wilderness and eventually are found by a unit of the 2nd California Cavalry. Unfortunately, they had to go through some very difficult things in order to survive. And some of that includes things that I don't want to talk about. I will mention one of them, which is cannibalism. And after they are rescued by the cavalry, they are taken by that unit to the Willamette Valley. And they continue to persist and become part of Oregon's history. And Emmeline is one of those people who shows the kind of courage and fortitude it took to survive some of these very difficult things. And I think it also says a lot about the quality of the woman, that after having gone through all of the things that she went to, she was willing to take in these two children who had lost their stepfather, and to care for them and to make their lives as good as was possible at that time. Now, I've reached the point where I could see if there are some questions that people have. I would be glad to answer them.
John, I don't see any about this section. We do have one from Eileen that goes back to the oysters.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, did the Japanese grow oysters here? And if so, did they lose their plots during the Second World War internment?
There are some Japanese American oyster growers in the Tillamook Bay, and I actually have a story about that I'm going to tell during the World War II era. So you'll hear a little bit about that. And yes, they did lose their claims, and they were removed from the area.
Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, I will point out something. There's some great books out there. This is one of them. This one happens to be on Timothy Goodale. Rediscovered Frontiersman, Timothy Goodale. And this is an excellent source of information about Mr. Goodale and all of his life and the things that he did. Another really useful book is Warren Bond's diary. This one is called Till Broad Daylight, and there's a great story in there about why that title exists. Both of those books are available at the Pioneer Museum, and I encourage anyone who is interested in Tillamook history to read them. They are fascinating and contain an incredible wealth of information. So, if there are no more questions about that, we will move on to World War II, always a popular topic. The first story I have to tell about World War II deals with the Tillamook Gorillas. It became really apparent to folks living on the Pacific coast that there was a threat of a Japanese invasion after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Immediately after that attack, the Oregon National Guard is sent to Australia and New Zealand. They are sent there in order to participate in campaigns in New Guinea and eventually in the Philippines. But they're not in Oregon anymore, and so there's a concern about having a military defense here. The Oregon State Guard is then called for creation, but that guard hasn't formed. And I think this is a tremendous story about the resilience of people from Tillamook and their ability to handle difficult situations and to find local solutions. They began looking for an option to provide defense in their area. And as a result of that, a man by the name of Stuart P. Arnold, who is a World War I veteran, he was actually blinded during World War I, and he calls for the creation of a guerrilla rifle club. And they have their first meeting. 68 people, 68 men show up to participate in this rifle club. Later in the month, that month of March 1942, they meet with Colonel Ralph Cowgill, who was the commander of the State Guard, which is a unit that exists only on paper at that point, and Gerald Owens, who is Governor Sprague's Civil Defense Coordinator. At that point, they have 1,800 men who have volunteered to participate in this guerrilla unit. Mr. Owens provides them with a handbook on how to be guerrillas. Later on, women begin joining the group, and they form a women's auxiliary called the Guerrilla Women. Now, this group is composed of, and I have a picture here of, there they are assembled. They're farmers and they're loggers, they're business people, they're all kinds of folks who have come together to study the guerrilla handbook, to begin rifle practice, to actually conduct beach patrols, and they continue doing those beach patrols until the Coast Guard takes over sometime later. They brought their own weapons, they brought their own food, own clothing, and ultimately they formed 24 companies in Tillamook and in some of the other coastal counties, particularly Lincoln County. And this is because they see the attacks in Hawaii, Alaska, and California as real threats. Now this goes on, and the guerrillas catch national attention, and they get a lot of publicity. And eventually they're absorbed into the State Guard once it is actually a functioning organization. And that happens in May of 1942. So you can see this is a relatively short period. And part of the reason that they get absorbed is because there are some difficulties with discipline. And in order to get greater organizational control and greater functionality of the group, they're absorbed into the State Guard. And I should mention that this is written up in a magazine called Soldier of Fortune. And you can see down here where it talks about Tillamook guerrillas. And there's a great story that's contained in this particular magazine about the Tillamook guerrillas. Not just those pictures I showed you a moment ago, but also another story that talks about some of the other issues that came up. Apparently, several men were drinking at a local tavern. They decided that they needed to do something to strike out against the Japanese. And they decided to attack some Japanese American oyster farmers who are living in shacks on Bay Ocean Spit. So they all go home, they grab their guns, and they fill their pockets with ammunition, and they begin creeping out onto Bay Ocean Spit one night. They creep up on the shacks and they begin firing down into these small buildings. Now the oyster farmers, who are Japanese Americans, and they're not allowed to have guns because that was not permitted. So they have nothing to defend themselves with, and the only thing they have that explodes are some firecrackers they had from a recent celebration. And so they light those firecrackers and they throw them out the window. Well, this is very disconcerting for these young people who are attacking, and they decide that it's best to retreat, and they begin running back down the spit. One of them falls over a log and breaks his leg. And that's the only casualty from this particular battle. But I think on a more positive note, I think the Tillamook guerrillas demonstrate the kind of community spirit that people have in Tillamook. And I think it's a great example of how people can stand together and make sacrifices for each other and do things to help each other. So now I have another story from World War II. And this also comes from some questions that were raised. And this has to do with Radar Road. If you drive up the road towards Cape Mears Lighthouse, you see a sign that says Radar Road leading off towards the Pacific Ocean. And I should mention that this is one of the places where Tim Carpenter really helped point me in the right direction to find some useful data. You have to go back to the very beginning of World War II, just as I was just talking about. In June 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacks Dutch Harbor, Alaska. They occupy two islands, Attu and Kiska. Now, they're not driven out of those islands until August of 1943. They occupy those islands for two reasons. One, it helps prevent Americans from launching attacks on the northern Japanese islands. And two, it creates a threat towards American territory that causes the American military to place resources there. So that's not the only thing that's going on in that era, though. There's actually an attack in Oregon. This happens to be a picture of one of the cannons that existed at Fort Stevens back at the beginning of World War II. And Fort Stevens is shelled by a Japanese submarine. This happens in June of 42. In February of 42, there had been a Japanese submarine that had shelled an oil refinery in California and started a small fire. Not a lot of damage, but some. It was because of these kinds of attacks and the fear that became associated with them of an actual Japanese invasion that the Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps. Because of this concern about an invasion, the United States government decided that they needed to install radar stations all along the Pacific coast. And there were two different kinds of radar stations. There was a short range radar that was to be used to direct actually defensive attacks on the incoming invaders. And there was a long range radar that was used to detect aircraft as far out as 200 miles out. Now on the hillside east of Radar Road, you will find one of those sites. It is a site for the long range radar, which happens to be, and you'll love this designation, it is the SCR-270-B Mobile Radar Set. What a great name. Only the military can come up with names like this. And it's one of the long range sites to detect planes coming in from far out to sea. Now, to house that, they had to build some things. And this is one of the installations that still exists up on that hillside. It had two protected entrances encased in 12 inches of cement. There were 4 rooms, an operations room, a duty officer room, an equipment room, and a room for the 2 generators used to generate the radar signal. It had an operations crew of 40 to 50 men, and it was commanded from the headquarters base at the Portland airport. Now they had a support facility, and that support facility was on the west side of the highway. In fact, where you see that sign that says Radar Road, if you followed that in, which I'm sure the residents wouldn't appreciate you doing, you would find the area where the barracks, the mess hall, and the other support facilities were located. That site was maintained there as a coastal defense installation until mid-1944. That base area was eventually abandoned. It's now become a housing area. The radar site buildings are still up there, but it's a very steep and not exactly safe climb to get up to them. And they're only occasionally visited. But it shows you how events thousands of miles away can impact local areas and local people. So, unless there's some questions coming up there on that, we can move on to another story.
No questions so far, John.
Okay. Boy, I must be doing a really good job. Nobody's
Absolutely doing a good job.
Wow, am I ever good? It's so nice. Okay. One of the best known and often told stories of World War II in Netarts deals with the crash landing of a B-17 on Cape Lookout. Now, I want to take a little different tack rather than talking about death and destruction. I'd like to talk about survival and what that takes. The story really begins about 300 miles east in the Pendleton area. Pendleton, Oregon was the home of the 541st Heavy Bomber Squadron, an element of the 383rd Bombardment Group. This was a special group created just for the training of people who were going to be using 4-engine bombers. That's like the B-17s, the B-24s, later on the B-29s. Now, once they were trained, they were then assigned either to the Pacific or to the European theaters of war. And the particular plane that we want to talk about is the one that you see in the picture here today. This is a B-17F. The one that crashed on Cape Lookout was serial number 42-30326, and it was one of 2,300 B-17Fs that were built at Boeing's Seattle plant. Now, this particular plane was better armed and a more armored version than a lot of the B-17s that had been created earlier. It was famed for its ruggedness and reliability, its maneuverability, and eventually 12,700 B-17s are built during the World War II, and many of them continued in the service even after the war. There were 10 men assigned to this plane. I have a picture here, it's not a very good one, of the 10 people who were assigned to this particular bomber. There were 4 officers: Lieutenant Roy Lee, who was the pilot, Lieutenant Robert Wilkins, who was the co-pilot, Lieutenant Victor Lowenfeld, who was the navigator, and Lieutenant Wilbur Perez, also known as Buck Perez, who was the bombardier. And he is the one who is second from the left. And I point out that particular picture because he is the only man of these 10 that survives that day. Now, there were also enlisted men involved with the plane, all sergeants. Delmer Priest was the engineer. Hoyt Wilson was a gunner. The assistant engineer was William Brunner. There was a Benjamin Puzio, who was a radio man, and a Paul Manville, who was assistant radio man. Harry Lilly was another gunner. All of them were new to the Air Corps. All of them were new to each other. In fact, Roy Lee, the pilot, had just been married just a couple weeks before. Now, on August 2nd, 1943, they're called to a briefing. This is to be their final briefing because this is their final graduation exercise. And they, along with 5 other crews, are being assigned to take and do a routine patrol and navigation flight, and which is meant to return to their base by 5 p.m. For some unknown reason, and we don't really know what, the pilot, Mr. Lee, Lieutenant Lee, was 15 to 20 minutes late for the briefing. And as a result of that, the plane winds up leaving by itself a half an hour later at about 9 a.m. They fly at 10,000 feet towards the rally point, which is at Cape Disappointment, the mouth of the Columbia River. But when they get there, the fog is so thick that there's no possibility of finding their other folks. So they're trying to decide where they're at, and they believe they are out over the ocean northwest of the Cape. And so they believe that the best thing to do is to drop down close to the surface. So they take the plane down to somewhere between 50 and 100 feet above the ocean. And they begin looking for some kind of recognizable, identifiable site that will tell them where exactly they're located. But as they fly towards the southeast, they realize that they're getting closer to the coast range. And so as a result, Lieutenant Lee decides that it's time to start climbing the plane up. Unfortunately, that decision is made a little late. At 11:30 a.m., they hit the tops of the tall spruce trees at the crest of Cape Lookout, which is about the 900-foot level. They are flying at about 200 miles an hour at that point. The result of that crash is to shear the plane into pieces and to propel Lieutenant Perez right through the nose of the plexiglass nose cone. And you can see there's kind of an entrance thing right here, and Lieutenant Perez is propelled through that. He finds himself hanging by 1 foot upside down in a tree. That's got to be an exciting day. So he struggles and eventually is able to untie his shoe. And when he does that, he drops down through the foliage to the ground. At this point, we know that he had a broken hip and had dislocated his shoulder. as well as having a variety of other smaller injuries. He can see that there's a fire burning towards him as a result of the plane crash, and he can hear 2 or possibly 3 other men moaning and calling for help. But he's unable to crawl through that thick brush to get to them. Then, suddenly, there's explosions. 50 caliber ammunition from the 11 machine guns begins to explode all around him, set off obviously apparently by the fire. Unable to help, he crawls towards the sounds of the surf at the edge of the cliff, and he finds a place where he can lower himself down below the top of that cliff so that the bullets and shrapnel can't get to him. And he hopes that the fire can't get down there as well. Soon, the moans and calls of his comrades are silenced. Going in and out of consciousness, he lays helpless on that small ledge, waiting for enough light to be discovered. Now, in the meantime, 2 air warning guardsmen who are posted at Buzzard Butte, which is south of Sand Lake, their names are Charles Schmidt and Robert Poe. They report the sounds of an airplane crash to the Portland Air Base. And the Air Base looks to see if there's been any record of a missing plane, and there isn't any. And so as a result, they take no action. Well, these 2 men, Schmidt and Pope, know that there needs to be something done, and they keep calling and calling and calling, and no action is taken. Until that night, they are able to see a fire burning at the top of Cape Lookout. And as a result, they call the Forest Ranger Station. The Forest Rangers realize that something has happened, and they call the Coast Guard Station in Pacific City. The Coast Guard Station there dispatches a 3-man rescue team that travels along the beach up to the base of Cape Lookout. And they began a very treacherous and difficult, challenging climb up through those dark cliffs, arriving at the crash site about 1:30 a.m. Now they look around the site with flashlights, and they find no one living. They call out, they hear nothing. And they continue to search until one man almost falls off the cliff, going down through some brush that's growing at the edge of the cliff. And he's able to capture the roots and pull himself back up. And at that point, they decide that it's time to leave. And they start struggling back through the dark to try and find a way back down to Pacific City, but they can't find one. They do eventually find the trail built by the WPA for the park. And that park trail leads them down to Netarts, where they call in their report by telephone because their walkie-talkies, their radios are not functioning. Now there's a speculative story that I have read that Lieutenant Perez used a propeller part banging on a piece of metal to attract the attention of a fishing boat that raced back to port to notify the authorities. I haven't been able to corroborate that report. I do find another corroborated report that states that the Navy launched a blimp from the Tillamook base in the morning, and that blimp's crew spots Perez on the cliff edge. They then get another rescue party started up from Netarts, who are using military and local people, and they reach the crash site, and they find Lieutenant Perez alive, but in shock. They fashion a litter out of tree limbs and shirts, and they carry him down. They struggle carrying him down, but eventually get him down and put him on a truck and take him up to Fort Stevens Hospital, where he's joined by his 19-year-old wife, Jerry. An officer at the fort loaned them a home, and Lieutenant Perez stays in that home while he continues to heal enough so that he can go off to rehabilitation. It takes him 3 years to heal from this crash and the damages caused by it, and ultimately he retires as a captain. Now, he returned twice to view the site and to see the marker that was dedicated to the crew and their deaths, but it's located about 500 feet from the crash site. Excuse me. If any of you are interested in seeing that marker, is easily found. Excuse me. Now, Captain Perez, dies in 2009, and he's buried at Mission San Luis Rey Cemetery in Oceanside, California. There is a great video made by Northwind Videos and broadcast on Oregon Public Broadcasting that gives a detailed and extremely vivid account of all that went on with that crash and the subsequent rescue. What impressed me about this whole thing was, one, Lieutenant Perez's amazing luck. I mean, of all those men, he winds up propelled out of the plane and landing in a tree. It also shows how his personal courage and tenacity and the help of so many others resulted in his surviving. And I should point out that Schmidt and Pope, who continued to persist in their efforts to get him assistance, ultimately are recognized for their continued assault on the bureaucratic malaise, and they are recognized and given a citation for their assistance and help and persistence in getting him help. We all need to be courageous, and we all need the help of others to survive and prosper. But this is, I think, one story that really illustrates the truth of that so really well. And that gets me to my last World War II story.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Before you go on to that, there's a question about where exactly is that marker? Is that something we can see even today?
It is. If you go up to the trailhead, which is at the top of Cape Lookout in the state park, and just walk down that trail, you will find it. It's easily found.
Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? Okay.
It doesn't look like it.
Okay. Let's move on to what I call the Battle of Cape Lookout. And this will be the final World War II story. One of the things that kept coming up as I was doing these presentations over the years was that were consistent rumors about a battle that occurred and the sinking of a Japanese submarine. And that battle involved the blimps from the Tillamook Naval Base. So I began looking into records, and this is where the Tillamook Air Museum was an enormous help to me. They actually were able to get access to the naval base records, and they confirmed that there was a naval action that occurred in May 1943 near Cape Lookout. And that activity involved this boat, this ship. This is the 173-foot subchaser PC-815. It was commissioned in Portland's Albina shipyard in April of 1943. I think it's interesting, as another aside, my grandfather worked in the Albina shipyard during World War II and built subchasers, and it just would be great if I could find out that this is one of them that he built. Anyway, after action trials on the Columbia River, PC-815 is sent to Astoria, where it is given ammunition, and it is directed to go to San Diego to take up its base duties. Now, during that trip towards San Diego, 10 to 12 miles off the end of Cape Lookout, the sonar operator reports multiple submarine contacts. Without hesitation, the subchaser commander, captain, orders the ship to attack this submarine wolf pack. Over the next 68 hours, the crew uses up their entire supply of 37 depth charges, as well as a variety of 3-inch cannon shells and a lot of other smaller munitions. When they run out of ammunition, they realize they need help, and they call for that assistance. And blimps K-39 and K-33 are ordered launched from Tillamook to assist in this battle. They are later joined by 2 Coast Guard ships and 3 U.S. Navy subchasers. The captain of the PC-815 reports that one submarine, which he later identifies as the I-76 or I-176, is sunk, and another severely damaged. And that's where things start to get a little sticky. because as it turns out, none of the ships or the blimps other than the PC-815 can find any evidence of any submarines. And there's a furious exchange that goes on between the lead Navy subchaser and the PC-815 captain, which is eventually sent up to the commander and command ladder to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Fletcher, who is charged with sorting out what actually happened here. As it turns out, and I should mention that the blimps use a different detection mechanism than the subchasers. The blimps cannot use sonar, they have to use magnetic detection. And they find that there is a large magnetic anomaly in the area where this battle occurred. And there is no physical evidence that any kind of damage occurred to anything other than the subchaser. And so the admiral rules that no submarine existed, and a negative notation is made in the file of PC-815's captain. The ship is ordered back to Portland because during this battle, this is a picture of one of the blimps that came to the area to evaluate what was going on. And this ship is sent back to Portland to repair the damage that occurs to the ship's mast, as well as some other damage, underwater damage that occurs because of the depth charging. And I should mention that there are 3 men injured when that mast collapses. Now, there's no further action taken against the captain. And given the shortage of officers, he continues on. And after the repairs are made to the subchaser, he escorts a brand new aircraft carrier that's built up in the Puget Sound area down to San Diego. A short time later, after PC-815 arrives in San Diego, they are ordered to participate in a practice training operation. And as a result, they move south down into Mexican waters. Interestingly enough, the captain of the 815 decides, without provocation, to attack Mexico. And I say that because he begins shelling a small Mexican island and using it for target practice. Well, he doesn't do a lot of damage, although it certainly didn't make the people who were in the fishing village happy. But it causes a major international incident. And the Mexican government is very upset about their country being shelled by one of their allies in World War II. And as a result of that, the captain then moves on to other duties other than being on a subchaser. Now, it is worth noting that the submarine I mentioned earlier, the I-176, is sunk by American destroyers in the Coral Sea a year later, in May of 1944. It is also of note that this was a very challenging time on the West Coast. The submarine I-117 had shelled the Santa Barbara oil refinery. The Japanese attack on the islands of Attu and Sitka. The Battle of Midway has occurred. The attack on Fort Stevens has occurred. Japanese Americans are being sent to internment camps, which is, I have to admit, from my perspective, a shameful episode in American history, but somewhat more understandable, if not forgivable, because of the uncertainties of the time. So you can see that when things are challenging, very often other challenging kinds of things occur, and it can be a very difficult time, and not all of the decisions that are made are the best decisions. Now, I thought maybe after looking at this study that the people that came to this session would want to know who this captain was. I mean, who was this dynamic, perhaps somewhat impetuous subchaser captain? And it turns out he is a person somewhat well known in America. His name was Lafayette Ron Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology. And I have used today the version of the story given by the U.S. Navy. But if you would like to visit the Church of Scientology's website, you can have a kind of a different perspective on Lieutenant Hubbard's naval service. And I will stop at that point and not speculate on anything further. Now, that is the end of my presentation, and I'd like to see if anybody has any questions that I can answer.
John, Kathleen asked, what happened to the Japanese oyster farmers on Bay Ocean Spit after the attack on them?
My understanding is that they were part of the community that was moved to the internment camps. So the internment relocation facility was in Portland. It was the sock yards. They were held there for a period of time, some weeks, and then they were moved to, and I don't know which camp they were moved to.
There's also a request for you to go over the books again that you showed us earlier.
Okay.
And then also, you mentioned the OPB show? Is that something that people could find? I think that's in relation to the crash.
Yes. If you go on the web, you can find a reference to Fallen Fortress is what they call it. And it's a half-hour video. And I'd play it for you now, but I don't have the permission to do that. But anybody who goes on the web can view it. And it was publicly broadcast by OPB, so I think that it's okay for people to take a look at, and is easily found on the web. So the books I looked at earlier, I mentioned earlier, one of which is Thomas Vaughn's Till Broad Daylight, and that has to do with some great stories he tells about the Tillamook Indian Wars, which is in itself a fascinating study of humans and what happens with humans under pressure. Great diary, well documented, clearly a useful resource. The other book I talked about was Rediscovered Frontiersman, Timothy Goodale. This book also is available at the Pioneer Museum. A great look at one of the really interesting characters of our local history and of Western history altogether. As long as I'm talking about books, I'll also point out that the museum has some other great books. Tillamook Memories, an excellent place to start looking at your study of Tillamook history, and another one called Tillamook History. Also, both of these are available through the Pioneer Museum. Excellent places to look at to find out something about Tillamook history and our early activities and all these people that lived between the capes and what they were up to.
Fantastic.
Questions?
I don't see any other questions. Lots of input about thanks for a very interesting presentation, and that was fascinating, which I definitely agree with.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, it's always a pleasure to do it. And as I said, it's just been quite a journey for me. I had no idea how it's like a treasure hunt. You start out, you want to find this little bit of information, and pretty soon you're talking to this person, and they lead you to this person, and they tell you to check this archive. And I find out organizations that I never even heard of exist, like the Oregon Genealogical Society, which is a tremendous resource for the early pioneers and what they were doing in Oregon. And it's just sort of been a lot of fun on those days when I'm not pulling out my hair, and you can see much left, so I've got to start cutting back.
So we're going to put you on the spot here, John. Mark asks, when can we expect your book?
Well, I don't have a definitive date yet. I have begun writing it. I would really like to have it done by the end of the coming year, and that is what I hope to accomplish, but some of that depends on some information resources becoming available that are actually not available right now because of the virus has shut down some things that I need to be able to get to. But assuming that those resources become available, I believe that we'll have something to look at by the end of next year, and hopefully have something published or generally available electronically by the following year. So.
Well, John, we really appreciate your doing this. Appreciate your passion for the topic. We're really benefiting from it. Since people can't applaud, I'm gonna try to do that by
Oh, thank you. That's great. Thank you so much. All right.
And, thank you, John. Thanks everyone for tuning in today.
All right. I'm going to sign off as well.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Paul.